And we are live. Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode number 65 of Circle of Fellows. This is a monthly live stream in which IABC fellows get together and address a topic of interest to communicators, hopefully everywhere. And I say everywhere because we have our most international panel to date. In fact, that's why we are doing this at 6 p.m. Eastern Time instead of noon Eastern Time. That allows us to bring in folks from Australia and from the Philippines, and everyone will get a chance to introduce themselves here in just a minute. I want to remind everybody, though, that you can ask questions during the course of the panel. You can do this either through the chat utility in YouTube or on Twitter using the hashtag COF65. That's Circle of Fellows, episode number 65. So COF65, and we'll present the questions that you have to the panel. By the way, I am Shel Holtz, your moderator. I am also a fellow, and I am director of internal communications at Webcor, which is a commercial builder headquartered in San Francisco. And I'm going to ask the members of the panel to introduce themselves now. It'll be based on how I see you on my screen, starting with Martha.
Hi, I'm Martha Mazechka, and I live in St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, at the far east of the country. And I work primarily in nonprofit and reputation management communications, and I also do strategic planning and training.
Wonderful. Glad you're here, Martha. I understand it's snowing there.
It is quite a bit.
Oh, boy. Okay. Adrian, is it snowing where you are?
Certainly not. We're right at the opposite end of the scale as we're hitting our heat wave this week. Finally, it comes in summer. So I'm Adrian Cropley, and I am in Melbourne, Australia. I am the founder of the Centre for Strategic Communication Excellence and Cropley Communication, which is consulting organization globally. Longtime member of IABC. Very happy to be here on the Circle of Fellows. Currently, I have got a job working with an organization where I head up employee experience and customer experience. And I've got about 6 teams under my gamut there. So plenty, hopefully, to talk about in terms of our topic today.
Absolutely. In fact, since you're doing employee experience, I can think of another whole batch of questions to throw into the mix. Ritzy, you're up next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ritzy Villarico Ronquillo. I'm all the way here in Metro Manila, Philippines. And it's the start of day here, so it's 7 o'clock in the morning. So that just goes to show how international we are. So I'm so thrilled to join you for the first time, this time for the episode number 65. I'm consulting here and doing trainings on business communication and strategic public relations. Earlier on, I was in corporate, a great many of my years, nearly 30 years in energy, and then another so many years in construction, solutions, and manufacturing. And aside from that, I would teach part-time too. So this is exciting for me, and I'm very thankful and happy to share whatever it is has happened in my life for the past 40 years, as well as being an IABC member has really been something that has truly enriched my life. So thank you for this.
And Ritzy, I should say, is also a very gracious host should you happen to visit the Philippines.
That is right.
Yeah.
I have hosted 2 of you. So Martha and Jennifer, if you are in any part of the world near the Philippines, please pass by. I'd also like to mention that I'm really hoping that we'll get a lot of entries this year for the Gold Quill Awards, because I happen to have the tour of duty to chair the Gold Quill Awards this year. So it's a great thing for us to recognize each other. Thanks.
And I am co-chairing one of the Blue Ribbon panels.
Yes.
Jennifer, you're up now.
Hi, everyone. I'm at the opposite end of the country from Martha on the west coast of Canada in Vancouver, where I have my own storytelling consulting firm called Forwards Communication. And I love doing these circles of fellows because they're just such a great opportunity to get together and do what we do best, which is toss ideas around and share and move us all forward. I've been really interested as a storyteller and a storytelling consultant. I've been really interested in the ways that stories have come to life for my clients in the past year. So I'm excited for this topic. And I've been saying since about last March that this is our time. This is our time to shine. So look forward to talking through things with everyone today.
Absolutely. And I have to say that I don't think I have to go back into the archives of Circle of Fellows to determine whether this is the first one that has only one American, and that's the moderator. And for anybody who's looking for Priya Bates, who was on the list of panelists, she regrettably had to cancel because of another commitment that arose. So we'll see Priya back on a future installment of Circle of Fellows. So today's theme is a review of 2020. Now, we have been doing Circle of Fellows for several years, and we've never done a review of the previous year when a new year starts, because I don't think the previous year was worthy of the kind of attention that 2020 got. I don't know if any of you have seen the commercial for Match.com, the matchmaking online service where Satan is looking for a match, and he goes out to meet his match, and he goes 2020, and she goes, just call me 2020. And they hit it off great. They don't want the year to end, and the tagline on this was make 2021 your year. It was actually a great commercial, but I think it speaks to how people feel about 2020. And for reasons that should be fairly obvious, we're going to extend 2020 through at least January 6th of this year, because it's just too recent an event to ignore when we're covering this kind of list of events and activities. But I'd like to start with something that you just said, Jennifer. And you said this would be our time to shine. Back in March, when the pandemic was starting to spread, it was late March when the order to go home came through, at least where I work. I haven't been back to the office since. It's been 10 months since I've worn a suit. I've only had 3 shirts that have had to go to the cleaners in that time. Jennifer, you said this was the time for communicators to shine. And what I'd like to hear from each of you is whether you think we have fulfilled that potential. Have we shown since March?
Well, I'll dive in and say that, and I'll think a little more on it as we all talk, but I certainly feel strongly that among all of the communication professionals that I know, that people have really tried their hardest at that. Only time will tell whether we've succeeded, really. But I think in the moments when we were called to step up and help our organizations, and in my case, my clients, our communities, muster facts, empathy, navigation through some just really complex times. We have been the people who needed to do that. And in all the cases I can scan my brain and think about, certainly those that I know have done that well. Most especially, of course, I have to say within healthcare organizations, our colleagues who are supporting those who are literally on the front line of this pandemic, and then on the flip side, supporting all of us who need those healthcare services or who rely on them, I think have been in just the most fragile and uplifting position. And I know a few firsthand who have really risen to that in remarkable ways.
Any other thoughts?
I'd agree, because I think that when we think about the public health messaging that we had to share and respond in a nimble way, because first we had little information, and then we had to react with public health information and share those messages. And I think one of the things that came home to me was how we were trying to promote not only staying at home, but maintaining distance and what that meant in terms of the words we used. So we talked about first social distancing, and then we looked at people still needed connections. So we moved towards physical distancing. And that led to a lot of creativity, trying to convey the messages, to make it simple and easy to understand so that people could act on the information to support the work that the healthcare services, from the front lines to intensive care units, as well as among those public agencies and those businesses that had to support the public. And I'm thinking of grocery store workers, drugstore workers, and so on, that the shipment of food and so on, that still had to continue. So we had to include in our communications all those different experiences, not just what was happening inside corporate institutions.
You
Go ahead,
Michelle, yeah, I was just looking at that, and that whole statement of was it our year to shine, and I think yes is the shortest answer, and the reason I say that is because every good communication professional loves a good crisis, and that is their time to shine. And you couldn't get a bigger crisis than COVID hitting at the beginning of last year, and how communication professionals have really had to step up to the plate, but they're there all the time within organizations where they've turned to the communication professional leading very, very tricky areas right throughout any organization in the world. So yes, we've seen it in the front lines with the healthcare workers, but every organization and every communication professional had to jump in there very early and navigate constant change throughout the year. Because if you think back to the very beginning, was this something that was just going to be around for a short time? Is this another SARS? Is it just going to burst and then fizzle out? No, it started hitting harder. There's lockdown messages. Then there was the re-emergent messages. There was the how we protect you, getting information from right around the world. But I think communication professionals just embraced that opportunity and said, we do what we do best, let's get in there and do it. And I think there was in any disaster, I think there's a sense of excitement that communication professionals were able to just kind of embrace an opportunity. And we got to see organizations listening to their communication professionals much more than they had done before. They really kind of said, well, now I know the absolute value that these people are offering our organizations. So I think that side of it was great. There was, I think, also an opportunity missed in communication as well, because we started to shine in the areas of COVID, but there was all this other stuff happening within our society at the same time in 2020, where I think there was some big misses from communication to step up to the plate around things like ethics and having a voice and advocating for the right stuff happening. The communication messages around civility, all of those things where we probably should have been stepping up even more. So it's been an interesting year altogether.
Certainly has. And by the way, Adrian, what you were saying reminded me of when I was addressing a crisis many years ago, and one of the members of the executive team pulled me aside and said, "You look like you're having altogether too much fun."
Yes.
And I said, well, imagine a firefighter who only ever gets to train and never actually gets to fight a fire. Certainly no firefighter wants a building to burn down, but still, that's...
But they get the energy from doing that? Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. There's some adrenaline to it all.
Yeah.
Which I think, just as a sidebar to that, I think I'm also seeing in my colleagues, especially again those who are really laying it all down, a degree of burnout that we need to take seriously. And I hope we can come back to some themes around self-care for communication professionals too, because this is a long haul. This is a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah, I will write that down so I don't forget.
Yeah.
But let's start with the pandemic, because we do have other 2020 topics to address. But one of the first things we had to do was start to communicate with a workforce that was now remote. assuming you weren't in a workforce that was already remote. I can't remember how big Zoom grew over the first few months from their user base before the pandemic to where it is now, but talk about massive growth. How did that affect communications? What did you see happening as communicators adjusted to communicating remotely and working from home themselves?
If I may chime in?
Please.
Yeah,
All right. Yeah. So I think this time of the pandemic, I describe it as it was a time when we found ourselves, and then we found each other. Because then what was left with us is what matters, what really, really matters. So you saw organizations and corporations, institutions, that if in good times they had established the trust, they had established the high morale and that camaraderie and esprit de corps among their internal audiences, as well as with their external partners, then when this whole pandemic struck, all they needed was to tap now into the goodwill that they had planted when times were good. Now, what I've been hearing from some CEOs of some of the companies here is that if they had the digital platform already up and working, then their turnaround time was quicker than those that did not. But then again, were the people trained for this sort of business continuity interruption? So, and the value system that the company had. This is a time when now people look back at their institution and would say, you said I was your best resource. Now I want to see the manifestation of that being your best resource in times of now and in terms of the HR policies that you are going to institute right now. Like, for example, work from home. So if again, the backbone, I call it the internal backbone or the tech backbone of the company or of your place where you work or where you stay was very stable, then you could do your work from anywhere. But then again, as for the could I talk with you? Can I be with you in person? That was another challenge we had to muster. But what I saw was that if the company was really, really strong in terms of building the pride in the company and people's roles were very clear, and that despite the disruptions like this, they were ready. So then they were still able to operate. So it really comes with preparation. And I guess that is the part of Crisis Calm that says that we prepare for these awful times in the good times.
Adrian, I'd like to throw a question at you based on the work you're doing with employee experience. In terms of corporate culture, a lot of that relies on shared experience. I feel that culture often is built and grows based on small moments, not necessarily big moments. And working remotely it caused a lot of the potential for those small moments and that shared experience to dry right up. What have you seen organizations do to replace that or to keep that momentum with their cultures going?
It's a really interesting question, Shel, because when you look at it from a technology side, we were already geared up in most part to embrace the technology and use it, but I don't think we'd been using it to the best advantage until we stepped into this. But what we saw, certainly within company cultures, is there was such a splintering between the work types. So, I look at it in organizations that I was working with, the IT functions and the more kind of insular and detailed functions, they just grabbed another Pop-Tart, got to work at home, didn't miss a beat. They were right on it. They as productive as ever. But then when you saw areas like call centers and so on moving to the home environment, yes, the technology could do it, but the disconnection from the organization, the energy you get with talking to people within the office, solving problems for customers, became a real issue. And so did and going back to a point Jennifer started mentioning, is the mental health side of things. And so there was a real disconnect in some of those functions. And what we saw our organization is then compensating for those by surrounding them with additional technology, because you couldn't be there physically, to then start saying, well, some of the programs that we are doing in connecting people, we need to do virtually, but we need to equip our people to be able to do that. We needed to bring the culture to the fore. So organizations that were really embracing the cultural messages for people. And I think what you were saying about those small moments were becoming important moments. So we saw organizations creating opportunities, and one was a great one in Anzac Day here in Australia, which is recognizing the war dead. It's a very important day that mostly the communities are out celebrating, and there's parades and all sorts. But there was some great social media campaigns, and organizations embraced it, where people were remembering from home. So was there still a dawn service? There was. And people would sit in their driveways with candles and be in their own remembrance service. And we would connect people by sharing those stories of people that did their own thing in their own driveways. Now, companies were doing those types of meaningful events to keep the culture connected. And as a result, what we had seen, and I've seen this with a few of my clients, with people are embracing the organization and engaging with the organization better because they helped them through this whole phase of COVID and kept the culture very, very close to them. So it was a really important question, Michelle.
Yeah, one of the other things that I heard was that there were organizations, for example, if the culture included concern for employees' well-being and they only had healthy snacks in the workplace. This is something that you don't see in your own home. So some companies started shipping healthy snacks to every employee's home to say, look, we still care about you snacking on healthy things. Has anybody heard of other efforts that have been made around the culture like that?
Well, so one of my clients is in financial services, and already what I'm about to describe sounds unremarkable because it's so common now, but early on, I'll never forget sitting in on an employee town hall, and the CEO comes on from his bedroom, because that's where it's quiet, because the kids are out doing school in the common area, and you just can't unsee the CEO's plaid bedspread and family photos and those sorts of things, and he was fantastic in acknowledging that intimacy that I think became, honestly, a hopeful turning point for many communication professionals in terms of the transparency we needed to bring to our work and to the workplace in a whole new way. But that same organization, again, in a bit of self-deprecating humor, sent gift cards to Bed Bath & Beyond and IKEA and those sorts of home decor places, and suggested that if you wanted to, get a new bedspread or put some new art behind you, that would be a way of helping out, which I thought was a great way of acknowledging the reality.
Over here, we started something when we had meetings, right? Because when we have meetings, usually like you have coffee or tea or just a few biscuits to go with it. What has happened here is that some, when they have meetings, they use the Grab service. It's a delivery service, so they deliver the snacks to the offices, to the homes rather, of the people who are on the meeting. For example, I had to judge for an award program, and instead of calling us all to one place and serving us a meal, what they did was we all went on Zoom, and the day before they sent us a basket of snack food, and they said, this is for all our 5 meetings or something like that. So it's which actually led also to the rise of delivery service. They were really one of the heroes we had when, you couldn't just go out and you couldn't just hand things to people.
Speaking of meetings, one thing that I both did in my organization and read that a lot of other organizations did is starting weekly all company meetings with the executives, updating people. I mean, far more frequently than we used to have the executive team meet with employees before. Is that something you've seen? And have you heard about communicators having difficulties convincing their leaders that they need to be visible more than they were before?
I reflect on that one, Shell. It was interesting because I expected that we would need to convince the executive more in some of the clients where you'd kind of been pushing them along a little bit. It seemed that the event of COVID kind of in their heads were, I need to be guided a little bit. And this is what goes back to that whole thing about the communication professionals' time to shine. So I think in my cases, they were listening a little bit more to the advice of why they should be out there a little bit more. They should be talking to people, and they were starting to embrace some of those opportunities. I mean, I still got, funny looks when we were suggesting some of the games nights and things like that to keep people connected online. But they went with the flow. But they really embraced the fact that they needed to be there putting the message out there in the most part. I didn't hear of too many cases where they were still very reluctant to it.
Jennifer, I'm curious if you heard from any of your clients the need for them to have stories to tell to employees during this time.
Absolutely. And just to build on what Adrian was just saying, in fact, I have one client organization that I'm no longer working with, who really struggled because their team of communication professionals, in fact, did not have discovered that they knew already, but they had a leader, a CEO, who was not going to show up well on the need for increased interaction in the way that you're describing. But yes, with several organizations, we talked through, again, a sort of a new authenticity that is something I've been passionate about for many, many years, and that's been a real struggle for many leaders and those in the corporate world to get their heads around. But we've just been up against this wall where we really didn't have any choice, because when when my kids are coming and interrupting, which my son just did coming home from school, and when you're again seeing the CEO's plaid bedspread, and you're seeing the effects of burnout and all of those things, you just have no choice but to get real and tell stories about that. And it becomes sort of woven in. And so in another organization I work with, in fact, in healthcare, that CEO, literally started off by talking about his grade school kids' homework quite regularly, and would kind of bring, the grade 3 math question of the day and throw it out as a bit of an icebreaker kind of thing.
And it was really good that we got to meet people's families and pets.
Yeah.
And I thought that was going back to that issue of culture, Shell, to bring the family into the workplace in that virtual way. I mean, our director of IT in the company that we were working with, he'd have his 3 kids online when we had competitions and game nights. We had to ban them after a while because they kept winning. The employees weren't getting a look in. No, we didn't really. But we embraced the whole fact that the families were coming together. They were taking part in it. And so it became the extension of the workplace. And so that message of care, I think, was really important. And going back to one of the points from earlier, what were some of the companies doing? I worked with an organization that sent care packages to their people. So it was not just how to work from home, but here's some stuff that you will need. So it was the basic essentials of the masks and the sanitizer and the how you set up your desk. But it was also the packets of Tim Tams, because we're in Australia, let's face it, you need those. And also, the cocktail mix for the evening. Now, I don't know too many companies that kind of encourage the drinking for employees, but we kind of knew who was the drinkers and the non-drinkers, and we had the cocktails and the non-alcoholic cocktails and sent it out and said, have one on us because this is a tough time. So it was acknowledging the issue.
I'll tell you, the HR VP where I work sent us all a cocktail kit and we all got onto a Zoom call with a bartender who taught us how to make a Mai Tai.
I love it.
Well, there you have it. There you have it.
Can I
Sorry,
steal that idea, Shell?
Sorry,
I love
Martha,
it.
you were going to say.
Well, I think that it touches on a really key point for me that I saw really emerge at the forefront. I mean, we all talk about connecting with our people and looking at our employees, helping them bring their whole selves, their best selves to work. But I think with Zoom culture and work from home culture, what we saw was a recognition that people had other lives and that these lives are what helped them be good and great employees. And when tested and called to step up and do things differently, people responded. And what I heard from a lot of my colleagues and friends was that they really appreciated that contact from their supervisor or their manager, and going up the different levels, you know, the messages that they got from the higher levels of the organization, that they recognized what people were bringing. And they also recognized the losses that people were experiencing in a number of different ways. You know, change in lifestyle, looking at how do you balance work-life balance in the home versus the workplace when now your home was both. And also the school environment, because for employees with children, they were now also facilitating and being responsible for that. And so I think the recognition of the humanity of employees, the whole person behind the job or the task, is what came out when people connected on that level, so that it wasn't just this facile greeting that you'd say, you know, how are things? And then you'd go on to the official agenda. But people took time to actually sit and listen and make that one-on-one contact, just to make sure that people were being still connected in that way, because they no longer had the hallway conversations or the water cooler chats. And how did you create or replicate in different ways? And so we saw people doing picnics outside or distant conversations where they stood 6 feet apart, but at least that they could see people outside of the little square on Zoom. I also heard about people switching things up and actually getting on the phone to have chats with people, so to reduce the amount of time that you spent looking at a screen. Because as much as you like chatting with people and being able to do things, sometimes the impact of Zoom fatigue was underplayed or underestimated. So looking at people in a wholly different way to respect the whole of their humanity. And I think that's also why when we saw the political issues and the global attention to Black Lives Matter and the conditions that were occurring in the States, and also making us in different parts of the world look at those conditions of racism and inequity, and the lack of attention to inclusion, we had to look at people in a whole different way that we've been needing to look at. And for whatever reason, how we're socialized, colonialism, etc., that we have cut ourselves off from those different aspects of people's humanity.
Yeah, we're going to get to Black Lives Matter in a minute. Before we leave the pandemic as a topic, I do want to talk about Zoom fatigue and the general burnout that people have experienced. I know that I've done a fair amount of communication at WebCore on how to avoid Zoom fatigue. And interestingly, one of the recommendations was, does it need to be a video? Can't you just get on the phone for a call? Was one recommendation. But how have communicators helped organizations reach out to employees and help them address the fatigue that comes with this work from home situation?
What I'm hearing
and part
from,
of that, by the way, I have to note is the fact that without a commute, we're starting earlier and ending later. And people are just putting in more hours.
Yeah. What I'm hearing is exactly that, Shell, that some have been saying, now I don't really know when my workday begins and ends. That's one. But on the other hand, there's also that part of us who work that we say, I prefer Zoom calls because then I don't have to get on a vehicle and go through traffic for 2 hours to get to one place and then another 2 hours coming back. The only thing I think we have to really now define, and that's why policy and procedures and processes have to be really defined to say exactly when does it begin and end. So I find myself saying things more like, if it's really extremely necessary to get some kind of information from someone, and I know it's a little off the R, you really have to say, I'm sorry, I have to call you, or I'm sorry, I have to message you, but I really need this information. And then you say something like, but I don't need it. Perhaps, I'm not sure you're still awake, but, so it really brings out the respect and consideration from us that we have to be more aware of that. But I still hear some of my colleagues who say that some bosses don't seem to have that mindset. They just call at will. And so I hear of, the millennials, they're so much into work-life balance. They mind if you eat into what they consider their personal time and space. So I think that leaders, and especially on the HR side, when they make HR policies, and team leaders especially, and even top management, they have to now revisit, how is it that people work now? It has to be revisited, and it has to be on a reset button, because if the people burn out, then you don't really know what's going to happen next. And I'm also hearing that some companies have downsized. So now the workload of one person or two or three who have left are now left with the person who is still there in the company. And so he has to juggle all of this. So these are things that, if on the long spread, may take a toll on the quality, productivity, quality, mental wellness, and health of the people who are left behind in the company.
I think organizations have, Shell, and I remember probably a World Conference session where you talked about this several years ago. Companies have struggled with the whole idea of remote workforces, and many leaders have really, many who are resistant, cite, their fears about low productivity and those sorts of things. And, just to throw in a Gold Quill plug here, Ritzy, as evaluators, when we come to a Gold Quill entry, we're always asking ourselves, what's the burning platform? What would happen if a communication professional did not take this action that they're describing to us? Well, this year, that boiled down more profoundly than it has ever. And the answer to that was, if this person, this communication professional, or frankly anyone working for this organization, isn't doing their work, we stand to lose our business, kind of thing. And so I think along with that authenticity came, and I think is still coming, a level of trust in me to manage my day, in me to, and as someone who's worked independently for a couple of decades now, I've sort of grown used to. But I used to, I would head off in the middle of the day to take my dog for a walk, and I would just say to a client, I'm sorry, I have another meeting at that time. Now I say, I'm taking my dog for a walk. Do you want to meet in my ear while I'm walking? Or, I'm more fluid and I'm more honest about my fluid day, knowing that I'll be back at my desk probably at 8 or 9 o'clock, and that's my choice. But, I think that honesty about the ways that we're productive with our days has also, I think, been a benefit and a challenge.
It's interesting too, just building on that, Jennifer, is how language has had to change within organizations that are not used to it. I mean, you and I are in the same situation where we've worked from home for many years, and you're used to it, and your levels of productivity, when you take time out and you flex around the clients, and you could be working at 10 o'clock at night, but where the boundaries are. In many organizations, people, yes, they have been more productive because they've taken those commute times and put it into work and not really begrudge the organization. But where they've struggled is the ability to actually switch off. So we had to change some of the language that we use within the organization as well, to honor people that were doing this great work at home. I remember talking to one of the CEOs, and I said, you've got to stop saying when we return to work. when we're back in the office, because everybody is still working. And the more that we use language that is not honoring the fact that people are working for the organization, they're working remotely, they're putting so much effort into the organization, which kind of cut them off when we use language like, look, and we'll wait till we get back together, or we wait till we're working again. We're not. We're actually more productive than we've ever been. And so sharing from a communication point of view, I was sharing a lot of stats with the executive, talking about how much more time people were putting in, but also how much more we were actually achieving. And I'm now doing some of those comparisons now we're back in the office, as to what's happening. Good, sorry, good show. There was one more thing I just wanted to say in terms of getting back to your original question around Zoom fatigue. And one of the things that I found very clearly we had to do was do what we do well as communication professionals, and that's really start being very precise about how we use the different channels of communication. So yes, we had Teams available. What do we use Teams for versus the meetings on Teams versus Zoom meetings? And then when we were on those meetings like Zoom, and we're using them for workshops and meetings, how do we mix it up in using some of those other technologies for things like brainstorming and collaborative working? So trying to put as much difference into the channels as we possibly could, just to keep it interesting.
Yeah, by the way, one thing that I started doing on Zoom calls after reading about it, and recommend it highly to everyone, is to turn off your own image on the screen. We apparently spend a lot of time looking and making sure that we look okay, and then bouncing around to the other people on the screen. If I don't have myself to look at, I don't worry about it, and I find that these meetings go much better for me.
Jel, just two stuff to add. Coming from what Adrian was saying, there are two things that come to mind for Zoom meetings. One is, it may sound very basic, but all the more I really recommend pre-reads, because then it cuts down on the time that you have to, it's not like when you're in person, you have a little bit more time to kind of sit back and think about things. But if you have a pre-read, then everything can be predetermined already, and then you have more productive time online because people have limited time. The other one is, it has now spawned a new type of etiquette, all the more, as you mentioned, Shell, that when you're not, for example, if you're not speaking and you aren't sure if your surroundings are going to be that quiet, then go mute, or say you have to stand. So then go take off your video and then do your thing and then come back again. I mean, these are little basic stuff. But now the consideration and for each other and the respect. Now really, that's why I said in the beginning, it really, we've found ourselves and we've found each other, and we now realize what really matters.
Let's move on from the pandemic and talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, which came to the fore in a hurry with the murder of George Floyd. This was a protest movement that went global without any question, which I found remarkable. That it spread internationally the way that it did. And I think it put a lot of pressure on executives to pay attention to this. I have heard of organizations where the CEO said, it's always been my intent to do something more about this than we're already doing, but now it can't wait anymore. So a lot of organizations started focusing on DEI. I wonder what your perspective is on how communicators have done playing a role both in terms of internal communications and presenting an organization's DEI initiatives and culture to outside audiences. How have communicators done with that in the wake of not just George Floyd, but Breonna Taylor and all the rest?
I think so much work still has to be done because, say, for example, in Asia, we're used to people coming from different cultures. I don't know, but it seems to be that from this part of the world, we're used to coming together from different countries. So maybe, just maybe, it may not be a major issue here. We're very welcoming to people from different countries, and we have a lot of fusion, not only in culture but also in food and events and all that. But still, I think that just because it hasn't perhaps reared its ugly head over here, it doesn't mean that we do not talk about it. So I think, at least from our part of the world, what we should be doing is, a communicator should be, um, educating ourselves more on this issue, understanding it, and trying to see how we can now pick up that global concern and bring it to local level and assess what do we have here, what is our state, and so how do we prevent this from happening. Um, I also think that with the sustainability targets that companies have, within that is one pillar which is called the human capital. And if an institution is really serious about it, within that human capital, you can put in targets as regards, say, for example, by a certain year, X percent, say 30, 40% of your top management must be diverse. So then you institutionalize it as a company, so that it becomes part of KPIs and your balanced scorecard and your sustainability targets. But as a people, then I think communicators have to localize it and make people understand why it is so important and bring it down to, again, who we are as a people, and that we must respect each other and why. So I think it's catching up, but I think that so much work still has to be done. And it's not just a matter of communicating it, dishing out the information, but it's got to be an internal conversion, an internal buy-in. And then maybe we go back to schools. That's where really you plant the seed when they are young. That's when you put it all there, so that when they go to their homes, somehow, children, they have a way of telling us off parents. They have a way of telling us, but mom, that's not, and then when they grow up, we're creating a new generation that probably will not have to be told off, but will normally, and as a matter of innate sense of values and culture, be open.
Yeah, it's interesting, Ritzy, as you pick up on the point around children, and I think we have to look towards children more who just accept difference. I mean, it is there; they don't actually see it, and I think it's that conditioning that happens as we get older, and the workplace, and all of this unconscious bias stuff that comes into play. And I think that's been a real big focus on the back of those events. And it's not just Black Lives Matter, it's the Me Too movement and all of those social issues that have risen up, the stuff that we know is there, but it just we kind of unconsciously do stuff. And so I think what it's giving us now is a platform to talk more and to question more. And I have started to see that rise in organizations, certainly that I've worked with, that are starting to say, what is it that we don't know? What is it that we're not actually paying attention to? And so I think for communication, we're starting to do things that is one of our key channels of communication, and that is the ability to listen. So if we are starting to listen more and starting to respond more, I think that's really important. And we're seeing it with Indigenous communication here in Australia an awful lot more. So on the top of Black Lives Matter, and absolutely gained momentum here, but it was very much focused around our Indigenous population, and looking to how that's been squashed and ignored in the past, and is starting to give voice to some of those things. And it taps into a point that you made earlier, Shell, about culture. It's the moments. It's those little moments that go, right, here is a moment that we can learn, adapt, and change. And I think that's been a real positive off the back of these issues.
I think that's really important, Adrian, about the change component, because I was reading this article about how all these books were bought and ordered, and they interviewed a bookseller, and they said, we still have 20, 40 copies of various anti-racism texts that have been written in the last couple of years by critical thinkers. And so there was a large element that was performative, that people spoke to a key issue, but they weren't actually following through and doing the work behind the issue. And what I've been seeing more of now is people saying, okay, how do we recognize the peoples whose land we stand on? How do we acknowledge our hidden biases, and what kind of language are we using that can shut people out or exclude them or diminish their experience? And so I'm seeing people putting together guides on, how to make social media accessible, how to be sure that the images and references are inclusive and diverse so that people can feel comfortable sharing those different parts of themselves. And so as a clear example, I was on a workshop before Christmas, and the workshop facilitator invited us to add after our names our preferred pronouns, so that everyone could identify how they wanted to be referenced. So I like to use the pronouns she and her. Other people like to use he and him, and still more like to use they and them. So how do we respect where people are and create those spaces where they can feel safe? And I think that was, to me, the more meaningful part of what I'm seeing are those moments where people are changing. They're recognizing that they're going to mess it up sometimes, but they're going to keep moving forward and listen to people. Years ago, I heard a speaker at a conference, an Indigenous woman from Alberta, and she said, the Creator gave us 2 eyes and 2 ears and only 1 mouth for a reason. And so she said, listen and look more and speak less.
It's interesting. We will be going through diversity training at my company, and after that, we are looking at making pronouns default part of email signatures. So last week, the Edelman Trust Barometer for 2021 was released, and one of the interesting outcomes of the survey this year, I don't know if you all have had a chance to dig into it yet, is that business is the only institution. They look at 4 kinds of institutions: government, media, NGOs, and business. Business is the only one that is seen as both competent and ethical. And your CEO, not CEOs in general, but your employer's CEO is seen as the most trusted spokesperson. CEOs are seen by employees as being the best source of information about what's going on. It seems to me that if we had an opportunity to shine starting last March, given the expectations that people have now of CEOs, we have a much greater opportunity to shine now. And Jennifer, I know you raised the issue of ethics earlier. I wonder what you think about, this expectation of CEOs as being competent and ethical and needing to be the spokesperson. What is the role of the communicator, and how does, say, the IABC Code of Ethics factor into that?
Well, just building on what we were just talking about, I think, I really think it comes down to, as so much of the practice of our practice does, a certain degree of common sense and, again, authenticity. So, we need to be living what we need to see, and we need to be asking our leaders to do that. And we've been talking about that for a long time around IABC campfires and many other places, about asking our leaders, calling on our leaders to be more authentic, to be more to be part of that moral compass. And I think many of us who've been around for a while, this is a pendulum swing for leaders, for CEOs in particular, our top leaders, to be seen that way, to be seen as in a position of trust. And I just think, more than ever, our IABC's code of ethics and any code of ethics that you choose to follow really calls on us to do the right thing, and to provide, to create the words that help us do the right thing and help our leaders do the right thing. There's a reason that that Amanda Gorman, the poet laureate who spoke at yesterday's US presidential inauguration, there's a reason that her poetry has resonated so profoundly around the world, because her words were about finding the words to do the right thing. And she wove them in a beautiful lyrical way that resonated with us. And that's, when you find yourself in a piece of writing, when you find yourself in a poem, when you find yourself in the words of a CEO's speech, that's when change is going to start within organizations and within our communities.
I have two questions I want to get to, and we have about 5 minutes left. The first one is related to the events of January 6th, the attack on the Capitol. You heard about this outside of the U.S., right?
Right.
A lot of businesses and a lot of CEOs went public with statements about that.
Yeah.
Richard Edelman came out and said that CEOs absolutely must talk to their employees about that. What guidance would you have to communicators whose CEOs are reticent about making statements, whether it's to internal or external audiences around something like this?
To me, it would be give the advice. That's your job as communication professionals, is to advise that executive and be very clear about what it is that they need to be taking a stand on. The thing is, the opportunity, and as you talk about Edelman Trust Barometer, is that the time is now for CEOs, the time is now for communication professionals. And while we're in a position of influence of those executives, we have to stand very firm in saying what is right, what is wrong, what we should be communicating out there, and have an opinion. And be prepared to walk away from organizations that don't stand for what is right in our society.
I think it's very important that the CEO really, if you have been working very closely with the CEO, and that's how it's really supposed to be, the communicator should be able to walk into that office and say, sir, ma'am, we have a problem, and this is what it is. And whether or not you get him or her to agree or to be happy about what you're doing, it has to be very clear to him that you must have the courage to walk up to him and do your job. And part of that job is telling the bad news and then providing a probable solution. I'd say that, especially if you work, say, for a multinational and you have operations, say, in the United States, and that happened, that is, or partners or external partners who you work with, I think it's very important that this be tackled immediately, and that if you operate locally, still it is important. Why? Because it all boils down to relevant values, and they have to see that you, as a leader, are out there making a stand and telling them, guys, this is what we stand for, and bring them back to core. That's always what I want. I always go back to that. When in doubt, go back to core. You build that strength within when there's no problem at all and in good times. But most CEOs would be hesitant. That's why they need you as the communicator. I would go forth and I'd say, I'm going to draft you key talking points. If he says, I don't want to talk to them personally, I'll set up a meeting. Or if he says, I don't want to do this, then you give him alternatives, him or her alternatives, and make sure he is heard.
And my friend Chip Griffin has commented through YouTube that CEOs should be reticent about speaking out on political issues. That is, they shouldn't speak out blindly, but rather thoughtfully consider relevance to stakeholders and alignment of words with action. And I just read an article that was 6 questions to ask before you tread into these waters of discourse on public issues. We have just about a minute and a half. And Adrian, I'm going to throw this to you, and I'm going to ask you for a 30-second answer. In the last year, have any competencies emerged that communicators should acquire that have not been part of the communicator toolkit thus far?
Look, I think that's a really easy one, Shal. I think emotional intelligence is something that really has started to emerge, both in the advice that we give in organizations and the one that we should be developing as a profession. Now, there's a number of others, but I think if it boils down to the core, we're moving into the era of reconnection, relationship building, healing. All of the things in this fractured world are the skills and the competencies we're going to need of the future.
Great. And now, as we wind down our last 30 seconds or so, I do want to let everyone know that next month we will be discussing entrepreneurship, being a successful communication consultant. This will be on Thursday, February 18th. We will return to our noon Eastern time slot, the regular time slot for Circle of Fellows. The panelists, there are 5. Next month will be Alice Brink, who I believe is watching live now, Amanda Hamilton Atwell from South Africa, Tosh Hattori, Marianne McCauley, and Angela Sinicus will be the panel for a discussion about going solo. So I hope to see the audience next time. And until then, I want to thank all of today's panelists for a great discussion that went by way too quickly. And also, as always, throw a thank you out to Anna Willie for the coordination of these behind the scenes. We would not be able to do it without Anna.
Yeah.
So thanks. See you all next month.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.